Welcome back to Streamberg Space Stories. If you're new here, this is a place for long, quiet journeys through the science and mystery of space. No rush, no noise, just you, the stars, and a story worth thinking about. If that sounds like something you'd enjoy, consider subscribing. Tonight, we're going somewhere different. Not deeper into space, but closer to home. To the thin, invisible shell of orbiting machines that modern civilization has wrapped around itself, and to the question of what might happen if that shell were to crack. Imagine that one evening, without warning, a small message appears on your phone's navigation screen. GPS signal lost. The route remains visible, but the blue arrow that marks your position suddenly stops moving. You restart the app. It takes longer than usual. You notice the time on your screen is wrong by a few seconds. A small thing. You ignore it. Somewhere else in the city, a delivery driver misses a turn. An airline pilot receives an alert about degraded navigation accuracy. A stock exchange in London pauses a batch of automated trades because the timestamps no longer align. None of these people know each other. None of them know what has happened, and that is exactly the point. The first shots of a war in space would not look like war at all. There would be no explosion visible from the ground, no sound, no smoke. There would only be absence, signals that stop arriving, data that quietly becomes unreliable. A slow, creeping uncertainty spreading through systems that billions of people depend on without ever thinking about. The violence would be invisible, and it would begin long before anyone called it violence. This is the story of how a conflict in space might unfold, not as science fiction, not as spectacle, but as something far more unsettling. A war fought in silence, above our heads, where the weapons are subtle and the consequences reach all the way down to the ground beneath our feet. To understand how fragile this could become, you first have to understand how deeply space has already woven itself into everyday life. There are, as of the early 2026, more than 14,000 active satellites circling the Earth. The majority of them, roughly 2/3, belong to a single constellation, SpaceX's Starlink, which now numbers over 9,000 spacecraft in low Earth orbit, and serves more than 10 million subscribers across 150 countries. But Starlink is only the most visible layer of a much larger architecture. Above it, in medium Earth orbit, 31 satellites form the American Global Positioning System. Europe operates Galileo, Russia maintains GLONASS, China runs Beidou. Together, these constellations provide the positioning, navigation, and timing signals on which nearly everything in modern civilization depends, and the word nearly may be too cautious. GPS alone supports more than 6 billion devices worldwide. It tells your phone where you are, but it also tells cell towers how to synchronize, power grids how to balance load, banks how to timestamp transactions, farmers how to plant rows with centimetre precision, and aircraft how to land in fog. A study commissioned by the United States National Institute of Standards and Technology estimated that the loss of GPS would cost the American economy alone more than $1 billion per day. If the outage coincided with planting season, the figure would be closer to $1.5 billion. And those estimates were made in 2019, before the pandemic accelerated the world's dependence on digital infrastructure. What makes this dependence particularly striking is its invisibility. When you check the weather forecast on your phone, you're reading data gathered by satellites in polar orbit, processed by algorithms calibrated against satellite observations, and delivered to you through a network whose timing is synchronized by satellite atomic clocks. When you pay for coffee with a contactless card, the transaction is time-stamped by GPS-derived timing to satisfy financial regulations. When an ambulance is dispatched to your street, its route is calculated using satellite navigation, and its crew may be coordinating with hospitals via satellite relay. These are not exotic applications. They are the ordinary machinery of a Tuesday afternoon. Weather satellites feed 85% of the data used in modern forecasting models. Communication satellites carry international phone calls, television signals, maritime data, and military command links. Earth observation satellites monitor crop yields, refugee movements, deforestation, and missile launches. The global space economy was valued at more than $630 billion in 2023, and projections suggest it will exceed $1.8 trillion by 2035. What this means, in plain terms, is that modern civilization does not merely use space. It lives there, in the way that a person lives inside a nervous system, not by occupying it physically, but by depending on it for every signal, every reflex, every coordinated movement. And like a nervous system, it is extraordinarily powerful and extraordinarily vulnerable at the same time. There is one more detail worth noting. The United States, despite being the nation most dependent on GPS, has no terrestrial backup system. China and Russia both operate ground-based alternatives. China maintains an extensive fiber-optic timing network with nearly 300 stations, and Russia has its Chaika system. The United States has been directed by successive presidential executive orders since 2004 to develop a backup. It has not done so. If GPS were compromised, the world's largest economy would have to rely on signals from foreign constellations, some operated by its strategic competitors. For most of the space age, orbit was treated as a kind of sanctuary. Not formally, the Cold War made sure of that, but practically. Satellites were expensive, and few nations could afford to build them. The ones that existed served mostly scientific or strategic purposes, and there was a shared, if fragile, understanding that interfering with another country's satellites was a dangerous escalation. The Outer Space Treaty of 1967 prohibited the placement of nuclear weapons in orbit, and declared space the province of all mankind. But it said nothing about conventional weapons, nothing about electronic warfare, and nothing about what would happen when dozens of nations and hundreds of private companies began filling the sky with hardware. That silence is no longer theoretical. It is now the gap through which the militarization of space is advancing. The United States Space Force, established in December 2019 as the sixth branch of the American military, was itself an acknowledgement that space had become a contested domain. By 2025, its budget approached $40 billion. It monitors approximately 15 missile launches per day from hotspots around the globe, manages satellite deployments, tracks debris, and oversees the secretive X-37B robotic spaceplane, a vehicle capable of spending years in orbit, changing its trajectory and returning to Earth, with a classified payload that the military declines to discuss. China, meanwhile, has built a formidable space force of its own. By mid-2025, its operational satellite fleet exceeded 1,060 spacecraft, with hundreds dedicated to intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance. The People's Liberation Army has developed ground-based lasers, direct-ascent anti-satellite missiles, electronic jammers, and a growing fleet of maneuverable satellites capable of approaching other objects in orbit for inspection or interference. In 2024, Chinese scientists publicly discussed work on a novel microwave weapon that could target satellites. The Shijian-21 satellite, ostensibly a debris cleanup demonstrator, has been observed performing close approaches to other objects in geostationary orbit, behavior that the United States military has characterized as consistent with offensive counterspace development. Russia, despite its economic constraints, remains a significant space military power. In November 2021, it used a Nudol missile to destroy Cosmos 1408, an old Soviet-era satellite. That test produced more than 1,500 trackable pieces of debris and forced the crew of the International Space Station to shelter in their spacecraft as the cloud passed nearby. In 2007, China had conducted a similar test, destroying its own Fengyun 1C weather satellite and creating more than 3,000 trackable fragments, many of which remain in orbit nearly 2 decades later. India tested its own anti-satellite weapon in 2019, generating approximately 400 fragments. These demonstrations were crude, the orbital equivalent of detonating a bomb in a crowded harbour to prove you have explosives, but they established a clear signal. The countries that dominate space are also prepared to fight there. What has changed since those tests is not the willingness to use force in orbit. It is the sophistication of the tools available. The Secure World Foundation's 2025 Global Counterspace Capabilities Report documents the development of counterspace weapons by 12 countries across 5 categories: co-orbital systems, direct ascent missiles, electronic warfare, directed energy, and cyber operations. China conducted 5 separate rendezvous and proximity operations with its satellites in 2024, maneuvering spacecraft close to other objects in ways that could serve inspection, intelligence, or offensive purposes. Russia placed a satellite called Cosmos 2558 in an orbit synchronized with an American government spacecraft, shadowing it for months. And in December 2024, the world learned that Russia had launched a satellite called Cosmos 2553, carrying a dummy nuclear warhead 2 years earlier, a test of components for a nuclear-armed anti-satellite weapon that, if detonated in orbit, could disable satellites across an entire region of space through the electromagnetic pulse alone. In April 2025, the United States Space Force published Space Warfighting, a framework for planners. Its language was unambiguous. Space superiority, it stated, is the basis from which the joint force project power, deters aggression, and secures the homeland. The framework described orbital warfare, electromagnetic warfare, and cyber warfare as the 3 pillars of space combat, and outlined offensive and defensive operations including satellite pursuit, escort, standoff attack, and the interdiction of communication links. This is no longer preparation for a hypothetical. This is doctrine. The United States is not alone in this shift. France restructured its Space Command in 2019 and announced plans to develop ground-based lasers capable of disabling adversary satellites. Japan's Space Operations Group, established in 2020, has been steadily expanding. The United Kingdom, Australia, and South Korea are all investing in space domain awareness and electronic warfare capabilities. Even nations that have not conducted destructive tests are developing the tools to interfere with satellites through jamming, spoofing, cyber intrusion, and directed energy. The Secure World Foundation's report notes that while proliferation of research and development into counterspace capabilities continues to spread, the most active developments remain non-destructive, reversible attacks that leave no debris and no visible evidence. These are the tools of the grey zone, where the boundary between peace and conflict is drawn in invisible ink. And this grey zone is where the real danger lies. Not in the spectacular destruction of a satellite by a missile, but in the quiet, deniable degradation of the systems that hold modern civilization together. A laser that dazzles a reconnaissance satellite sensor for a few minutes leaves no forensic trace. A cyber intrusion that subtly alters a satellite's telemetry data may never be detected. An electronic warfare system that jams a specific frequency in a specific region for a specific hour can deny a military force its most critical capability at the moment of greatest need, and no one on the ground may ever know it happened. If a conflict in space were to begin, not in some imagined future, but under conditions resembling the present, it would almost certainly start not with a missile, but with interference. A signal degraded, a command link severed, a satellite quietly blinded. This has already happened. On the morning of February 24, 2022, just hours before Russian ground forces crossed into Ukraine, a cyber attack struck Viasat's Ka-Sat satellite network. The satellite itself was not damaged. Instead, hackers exploited a vulnerability in a VPN appliance at a ground management center in northern Italy, gained access to the network's internal systems, and deployed wiper malware, a program called Acid Rain, to tens of thousands of satellite modems across Europe. The modems were rendered inoperable. In Ukraine, the immediate effect was a significant loss of military and civilian communications at the very moment the invasion began. But the damage was not confined to Ukraine. In Germany, more than 5,800 wind turbines lost their remote monitoring connections. Across France, Italy, Hungary, Greece and Poland, tens of thousands of broadband subscribers went offline. The Viasat attack was later attributed to Russia's GRU military intelligence by nearly 20 governments. It remains the most significant publicly known cyber attack against space infrastructure in history. And it revealed something that many strategists had long suspected. You do not need to destroy a satellite to neutralize it. You only need to disrupt the ground systems that control it, or the links that carry its signals, or the software that interprets its data. The satellite becomes a useless piece of metal drifting in orbit, perfectly intact and perfectly blind. The attack also revealed the cascading nature of space system vulnerabilities. The NSA later acknowledged that the targeting of a satellite internet provider had caught them by surprise. They had anticipated cyber attacks on defense contractors, not on the commercial satellite infrastructure that militaries had quietly come to depend on. The lesson was stark. In a world of interconnected systems, the boundary between military and civilian space infrastructure is a fiction. Attack one, and you reach the other. Since then, the problem has only deepened. The Space Information Sharing and Analysis Center reported a 118% increase in space-related cyber incidents in the first 8 months of 2025 compared to the same period in 2024. The real number is almost certainly higher because many attacks go unreported or undetected. A Chinese state-sponsored hacking group, having initially targeted American telecom providers, extended its campaign to satellite communications companies by mid-2025. The FBI has observed hacking attempts directly targeting satellites in orbit. Security experts have warned that the first ransomware attack on an operational satellite may be only a matter of time. Meanwhile, GPS jamming and spoofing have become routine tools of hybrid conflict. In 2024, more than 1,000 commercial flights per day were affected by GPS spoofing, the deliberate broadcast of false satellite signals designed to make receivers believe they are somewhere they are not. By August of that year, the number had risen to approximately 1,500 flights per day. In the Baltic Sea, the number of shipping vessels affected by jamming rose by more than 127% between the first and second quarters of 2025. Russia, which operates ground-based electronic warfare systems like the Krasukha-4, has been identified as the primary source of GPS interference across a wide arc stretching from the Nordic countries through Ukraine and into the Black Sea region. These are not acts of war in the traditional sense. They fall below the threshold of armed conflict, but they degrade the systems that militaries, economies, and civilian populations depend on, and they establish the conditions under which a wider conflict could begin almost imperceptibly, a gradual erosion of trust in the information flowing from orbit. The Ukraine conflict has also demonstrated another troubling dynamic. the speed at which commercial space infrastructure becomes entangled in military operations. Within days of the Russian invasion, Starlink terminals began arriving in Ukraine. They provided internet connectivity to civilians in bombed-out cities. They allowed President Zelensky to address foreign parliaments. And they carried military communications for Ukrainian forces coordinating drone strikes and artillery. The same constellation that a family in rural Nebraska uses to stream television was, simultaneously, a battlefield communication system. This duality is not an aberration. It is the new normal, and it means that any future conflict between spacefaring nations will inevitably draw commercial operators and their global user bases into the firing line. The most dangerous feature of this kind of warfare is not its destructiveness, it is its ambiguity. When a satellite fails, it is not always clear why. Satellites malfunction for many reasons: solar radiation, micrometeorite impacts, component degradation, software errors. The space environment is harsh, and failures are not uncommon. This creates a problem that strategists call the attribution gap. The difficulty of determining in real time whether a satellite outage is an accident, a natural event, or a deliberate attack. Now imagine that several satellites go silent within a short period. Different orbits, different operators, but all serving a single region. The signals they provided, navigation, communication, early warning, begin to degrade. Military commanders on the ground notice the gaps. They do not know whether they are facing a coordinated assault or a coincidence, but they know that their ability to see, communicate and respond is diminishing, and they know that their adversary has the capability to cause exactly this kind of disruption. In such a moment, the pressure to act, to assume the worst, to respond before the situation deteriorates further, becomes enormous. A senior Pentagon wargame involving officials from the Department of Defense, State Department, NASA, and the intelligence community explored precisely this scenario. The participants found that the ambiguity of orbital conflict made escalation dangerously easy. Without clear signals about what had happened and why, each side was inclined to interpret the other's actions as hostile and to respond in kind. Satellites were repositioned to block access to key orbital slots. Defensive maneuvers were read as aggressive posturing. The scenario spiraled. This is the paradox at the heart of space warfare. The very qualities that make orbital attacks attractive, their deniability, their reversibility, their subtlety, are also the qualities that make them most likely to spiral beyond control. A jammed signal can be restored, a spoofed GPS reading can be corrected, but the decision made on the basis of that false information, a ship diverted, a missile launched, a defensive posture hardened, cannot be so easily undone. And here is where the analogy to nuclear deterrence breaks down most alarmingly. In nuclear strategy, there are well-understood signals and hotlines, clear thresholds and doctrines of mutual assured destruction. These do not yet exist for space. There is no red phone between space commands. There is no agreed definition of what constitutes an attack versus a provocation versus an accident. Each side is interpreting the other's behaviour through a fog of technical uncertainty and strategic suspicion, and the incentives point toward preemption rather than restraint. If the conflict were to escalate beyond electronic interference and into physical action, the actual manoeuvring, disabling or destruction of satellites, it would enter a domain governed by rules that no military doctrine can override. The rules of orbital mechanics. Space combat, as physicists at the Aerospace Corporation have described it, would bear no resemblance to the battles depicted in science fiction. There would be no dogfights, no banked turns, no ships weaving through debris fields at high speed. A satellite in orbit cannot simply change direction. It is bound to an elliptical path determined by its velocity and altitude. To move closer to a target in a different orbit, it must execute a series of carefully calculated engine burns that alter its trajectory over hours, days, or even weeks. Changing orbital inclination, the angle at which a satellite's path is tilted relative to the equator, is extraordinarily fuel expensive. A satellite designed for 5 years of station keeping may have only enough propellant for a handful of significant maneuvers before it becomes a piece of drifting metal. To illustrate the scale of the constraint, in order for a spacecraft to travel in a straight line from an altitude of 400 kilometers to 1,000 kilometers, a journey that would take a few minutes by the intuitions of atmospheric flight, it would require a change in velocity of roughly 40,000 meters per second, delivered in 2 instantaneous bursts about 30 seconds apart. This is a staggering amount of energy. No existing spacecraft comes remotely close to this capability. Movement in orbit is not like driving or flying. It is like navigating a river of invisible currents, where speeding up makes you rise, slowing down makes you fall, and turning sideways costs more energy than doing both. This means that any physical engagement in orbit must be slow and deliberate. An attacking satellite would need to plan its approach far in advance, and its movements would be detectable by ground-based tracking systems long before it arrived. The element of surprise, so central to warfare on Earth, is largely absent in space. Orbits are predictable. Trajectories can be calculated. But this predictability cuts both ways. A defending satellite has limited options for evasion. Most operational satellites have little or no maneuvering capability. Even those that do are constrained by the physics of orbit. Dodging one threat may place the satellite in a less useful orbit, consume irreplaceable fuel, or inadvertently bring it closer to another hazard. What this produces is a kind of slow-motion chess, played in 3 dimensions across hundreds of kilometers of emptiness. Each move is visible, each response is constrained, and every piece that is removed from the board changes the game for everyone else. There is one consequence of physical combat in space that distinguishes it from every other form of warfare in human history. When you destroy something in orbit, the wreckage does not fall, it stays, and it moves. A satellite destroyed at an altitude of 800 kilometers will produce a cloud of fragments traveling at speeds of 7 to 15 kilometers per second. At those velocities, a piece of debris the size of a marble carries the kinetic energy of a hand grenade. A fragment the size of a softball can destroy a spacecraft. And because there is no friction in space to slow things down, these fragments will continue circling the Earth for decades, centuries, or in some cases millennia, crossing and recrossing the orbits of every other object at that altitude. This is the phenomenon described by NASA scientist Donald Kessler in 1978, and now known as the Kessler syndrome. The essential insight is simple. Above a certain density of objects in a given orbital shell, collisions begin to produce more debris than natural forces can remove, and the process becomes self-sustaining. Each collision creates fragments that increase the probability of the next collision, which creates more fragments, in a cascading feedback loop that can render an entire orbital region unusable. Kessler himself wrote in 2009 that the cascade should not be imagined as a sudden explosive event, but as a slow statistical accumulation, a gradual increase in the background collision rate that unfolds over years and decades. But the inputs can be sudden. A single anti-satellite weapon test, a single collision between large objects, can introduce thousands of fragments in an instant. China's 2007 test alone produced debris that still accounts for a significant fraction of the tracked objects in low Earth orbit. Russia's 2021 test added 1,500 more, and a 2024 Chinese rocket breakup generated over 700 fragments in the Sun's synchronous corridor, a region critical for Earth observation and climate monitoring, As of 2025, space debris experts estimate that approximately 130 million fragments larger than 1 millimeter are orbiting the Earth. More than 36,000 objects are large enough to be tracked by ground-based radar. The total mass of artificial material in orbit is approximately 14.5 million kilograms. SpaceX's Starlink satellites performed more than 144,000 collision avoidance maneuvers in the first half of 2025 alone. A collision warning every couple of minutes, around the clock, 3 times the rate of the previous 6 months. Certain orbital altitudes are already approaching critical thresholds. At 775 kilometers, at 840, and at 975, the collision risk is scaling up rapidly. Some researchers believe these specific zones have already passed the point of no return, that even with 0 future launches, the existing debris in these shells would continue generating new fragments through collisions for decades to come. And there is a natural accelerant that few consider. A major solar storm, a coronal mass ejection of the kind that last struck Earth in 1859, could temporarily disable the satellite tracking and communication systems that allow operators to perform collision avoidance maneuvers. A 2025 analysis found that a sufficiently powerful storm could knock out avoidance capability for long enough to allow debris collisions to occur within as little as 3 days. The same event that disrupts satellites on one front could trigger a debris cascade on another. The systems designed to protect orbital infrastructure from collision are themselves vulnerable to the same natural forces that space has always imposed. Now imagine what a conflict would do. Not a single test, but a sustained campaign of orbital destruction. Each satellite killed becomes a cloud of shrapnel. Each cloud drifts through the orbital lanes used by thousands of other satellites. The debris does not respect borders, alliances, or intentions. It strikes indiscriminately. A Russian fragment destroys an American satellite. An American fragment disables a European weather observatory. A European fragment damages a Chinese space station module. In a matter of weeks, the carefully layered architecture of orbital infrastructure that humanity spent 60 years building could begin to unravel, not through any single act of destruction, but through the accumulating consequences of many small ones. And the cruelest part is this: the damage would outlast the conflict by generations. A war fought in orbit in 2030 could leave debris fields that render certain altitudes hazardous well into the 22nd century. The victors and the vanquished alike would inherit the same wounded sky. While the debris cascades above, the effects on the ground would be felt immediately and across every domain of modern life. The first systems to degrade would be those dependent on precise timing. GPS and its counterparts do not only provide location, they provide synchronization. The atomic clocks aboard navigation satellites allow cell towers to coordinate, power grids to balance supply and demand, financial markets to sequence transactions, and data centers to maintain coherent records. In 2016, when a single GPS satellite was decommissioned and a timing error of just 13 microseconds propagated through the network, police and emergency communications were disrupted for hours across parts of North America, and power grid anomalies were detected. 13 microseconds. In a conflict, the errors would be measured in milliseconds or more, and they would persist. Communication would fracture next. International phone calls, maritime coordination, airline routing, military command chains, disaster response networks all rely on satellite links that, if disrupted, would place enormous strain on terrestrial alternatives. Undersea cables and ground-based microwave relays could absorb some of the burden, but they were not designed to carry the full load. In remote areas, where satellites are the only link to the outside world, the silence would be total. weather forecasting would deteriorate sharply. Without data from polar orbiting and geostationary weather satellites, forecast accuracy would fall to levels not seen since the 1970s. Hurricanes would arrive with less warning. Agricultural planning would become guesswork. Aviation would slow as pilots lost access to real-time weather data along their routes. Economic consequences would cascade. The global financial system depends on synchronized clocks and reliable data links. A prolonged disruption to satellite timing services could freeze automated trading, scramble logistics chains, and introduce enough uncertainty to trigger market volatility on a scale that has no modern precedent. And there would be a deeper, harder-to-measure consequence: the erosion of trust. In a world where no one is quite sure whether their navigation is accurate, whether their communications are being intercepted, whether the information on their screen reflects reality, the psychological effect could be as destabilizing as the technical one. Uncertainty is corrosive. It makes everything slower, more cautious, more fearful. It makes cooperation harder and suspicion easier, and it does not lift easily even after the signals return. There is another dimension to this scenario that makes it unlike any previous form of conflict, and that is the role of speed. Orbital mechanics may be slow, satellites maneuver over hours and days, but the electronic and cyber dimensions of space warfare operate at the speed of light. A jamming signal arrives instantaneously. A cyber intrusion can compromise a ground station in minutes. A spoofed GPS signal can divert a ship or confuse a missile in real time, and in an environment where the systems under attack are themselves automated, where algorithms manage collision avoidance, data routing, and threat assessment, the window for human decision-making shrinks to almost nothing. This creates a profound tension. On one hand, the physical domain of space favors patience and deliberation. On the other, the electromagnetic and digital domains reward speed and preemption. A nation that waits to confirm whether a satellite outage is an attack risks losing the ability to respond. A nation that responds too quickly to an ambiguous signal risks escalating a situation that might have been resolved. AI systems are increasingly embedded in both the offensive and defensive layers of space operations. Satellites use machine learning to manage their own orbits and avoid debris. Ground stations use automated threat detection systems to flag anomalies. Military planners use predictive models to assess adversary intentions based on orbital behavior. The danger is not that these systems will malfunction in isolation, but that they will interact in ways that no one anticipated. That an automated defensive response by one side will be interpreted by the automated monitoring system of the other side as an aggressive posture, triggering a counter-response and so on, in a cascade of machine-speed decisions that outpaces the ability of humans to intervene. We have seen this dynamic before, in other domains: flash crashes in financial markets, near misses in nuclear early warning systems. The lesson is always the same. When speed outpaces understanding, the risk of catastrophic error rises sharply. In space, where the consequences of a mistake are measured not in lost money, but in lost infrastructure that cannot be replaced for years, the margin for error is thinner still. What makes all of this more troubling is the absence of any adequate legal framework to govern it. The Outer Space Treaty of 1967 remains the foundational document of international space law. It prohibits the placement of weapons of mass destruction in orbit and declares that celestial bodies shall be used exclusively for peaceful purposes. But it does not prohibit conventional weapons in orbit. It does not address electronic warfare, cyber operations, or the deliberate creation of debris. It does not define what constitutes an act of war in space, or establish clear rules for proportional response. And it was written for a world in which a handful of governments operated a few dozen satellites, not for a world in which thousands of private and military spacecraft share increasingly crowded orbital lanes. Subsequent efforts have been piecemeal. In 2022, the United States committed to not conducting destructive direct-ascent anti-satellite missile tests and urged other nations to follow suit. A United Nations General Assembly resolution echoed that call, but Russia and China have not signed on, and the resolution is non-binding. Meanwhile, Russia has publicly stated that it considers commercial satellites supporting military operations to be legitimate targets, a position articulated at the UN General Assembly in October 2024. This is a doctrine that blurs the line between civilian and military infrastructure in orbit, and it reflects a broader reality. In an era of dual-use technology, where the same satellite constellation that provides broadband internet also relays military communications, the distinction between a civilian asset and a military target has become almost impossible to draw. The result is a legal vacuum in which nations are developing, testing and deploying weapons for a domain in which the rules of engagement have never been agreed upon. It is as if the world's navies had built fleets of nuclear submarines before anyone had written the law of the sea. If a space conflict were to expand beyond the initial phase of electronic interference and selective satellite attacks, it would enter territory for which there is no historical precedent. A larger orbital war might involve the systematic targeting of adversary satellite constellations across multiple orbital shells, navigation satellites in medium Earth orbit, communication satellites in geostationary orbit, reconnaissance satellites in sun-synchronous polar orbits, early warning satellites in highly elliptical Molniya orbits. Each type serves a different function, and each occupies a different region of space with different physical characteristics. Attacking geostationary satellites, which orbit at an altitude of roughly 36,000 kilometers, is far more difficult than striking targets in low orbit. The distances are vast, and the energy required to reach them is enormous. But geostationary satellites are also fewer in number and harder to replace, which makes them tempting targets for an adversary willing to invest in the capability. In response to these threats, the major spacefaring nations are moving toward proliferated architectures, replacing a small number of large, expensive satellites with large numbers of smaller, cheaper ones distributed across many orbits. The logic is the same as the logic of dispersal in ground warfare. A distributed force is harder to destroy in a single blow. The United States Space Development Agency has invested billions in deploying constellations of small satellites for missile tracking and data relay. The Commercial Augmentation Space Reserve, expected to reach full operational capacity in 2026, aims to give the military wartime access to commercial satellite networks. But proliferation creates its own problems. More satellites mean more potential targets, more debris sources, and more complexity in managing orbital traffic. And for the nations that cannot afford to build replacement constellations, which is to say, most nations on Earth, the loss of shared satellite infrastructure would be devastating. A war in space between the United States and China would not be fought over the heads of Americans and Chinese alone. It would be fought in a commons that every nation on the planet depends on. This brings us to one of the most unsettling dimensions of the problem: its asymmetry. A small number of nations possess the ability to wage war in space, but every nation on Earth depends on space for critical services. The country that suffers most from the destruction of GPS may not be one of the combatants, but a developing nation in sub-Saharan Africa that relies on satellite navigation for emergency medical transport and agricultural coordination. The fishing fleet that loses access to weather data may be in the Indian Ocean, far from any geopolitical dispute. The hospital that cannot synchronize its records may be in a country that has never launched a satellite. In this sense, space warfare is uniquely global. It is fought in orbit, but its casualties are measured on the ground across all borders among all peoples. The debris does not ask who fired the missile. The disrupted signal does not distinguish between combatants and bystanders. The collateral damage extends to every human being who has, often without knowing it, built their life around signals from above. There is a useful analogy for what uncontrolled destruction in orbit might look like, and it does not come from military history, it comes from ecology. When an invasive species is introduced to an ecosystem it was not designed for, the consequences are often slow to appear and impossible to reverse. Rabbits released in Australia in 1859 multiplied into billions, transforming the landscape permanently. Zebra mussels, introduced to the Great Lakes in the late 1980s, clogged water intake pipes, starved native species, and cost billions of dollars in damage. The brown tree snake, accidentally brought to Guam after the Second World War, drove most of the island's native bird species to extinction. In each case, the damage was done not by a single catastrophic event, but by a slow, compounding process that overwhelmed the system's ability to recover. That is the nature of debris in orbit. Each fragment is an invasive presence in a carefully balanced environment. Each collision introduces more, and unlike invasive species on Earth, orbital debris cannot be hunted, poisoned, or contained. It can only be avoided at increasing cost until avoidance is no longer feasible. Perhaps the deepest question raised by the prospect of war in space is not technical or strategic, but political. Who decides? The nations building space weapons are in many cases the same nations that have the most to lose from their use. The United States depends on space more than any other country. Its military doctrine, its economic infrastructure, its intelligence apparatus, all are woven through with satellite dependencies that have no terrestrial equivalent. China and Russia, while building formidable space forces of their own, are also building the orbital infrastructure that would be destroyed in a conflict. The logic of mutual vulnerability should, in theory, promote restraint. But history offers many examples of nations sliding into conflicts that rational calculation said they should avoid. This mutual vulnerability creates a peculiar kind of deterrence, not unlike nuclear deterrence, but without the clarity. Nuclear weapons are binary. They're either used or they're not. Space weapons exist on a spectrum. Jamming is reversible. Spoofing is deniable. A co-orbital maneuver may be an inspection or a threat. The thresholds are blurred, and blurred thresholds are dangerous because they allow each side to push a little further without believing it has crossed a line, until one day the line is behind them and neither side knows how to go back. There is also the commercial dimension. Increasingly, the satellites in orbit belong not to governments, but to private companies. SpaceX, Amazon, OneWeb, Telesat. These are commercial operators whose constellations serve civilian populations worldwide. In the Ukraine conflict, Starlink terminals provided critical communication links to Ukrainian forces on the ground, a role that prompted Russia to classify such commercial assets as potential military targets. Starshield, the military variant of Starlink, is now reportedly a frontrunner for the United States Golden Dome missile defense initiative. The line between commercial internet provider and military weapons platform has never been thinner. Military strategists often speak of the fog of war, the confusion, uncertainty, and incomplete information that characterize every conflict. In space, that fog would be unusually thick. A commander on the ground may know that a satellite has stopped responding. They may not know whether it was attacked, whether it malfunctioned, or whether its ground station was compromised. They may not know whether the failure is isolated or part of a wider campaign. They may not even know for several hours or days what capabilities they have lost, because the systems that monitor those capabilities are themselves dependent on the satellites that may have been affected. This uncertainty is compounded by the global nature of orbital systems. A satellite that serves military users in one region may also serve hospitals, airlines, and emergency services in another. Disabling it does not merely affect the adversary, it affects everyone within its coverage footprint. The speed at which orbital conditions change adds another layer. Debris fields evolve over hours. Satellite constellations shift as individual spacecraft maneuver or fail. The information available to decision makers is always to some degree out of date, and the decisions they are asked to make, whether to respond, how to respond, against which targets, with what level of force, are among the most consequential in the history of conflict, because the consequences are global and the mistakes are irreversible. Somewhere above us, right now, a satellite is crossing the sky. It is the size of a kitchen table, and it is moving at 28,000 kilometers per hour. It carries no weapon. It is doing nothing more than reflecting a signal back to a farmer's tractor, or correcting a ship's course by a fraction of a degree, or telling a hospital in a rural district what time it is, down to the nanosecond. It is a small machine doing a small thing, and it is part of a system that connects the entire human world. A system that we built slowly, over decades, with ingenuity and ambition, and that we have now so thoroughly integrated into the fabric of daily life that most people never think about it at all. The question that hangs over everything we have discussed tonight is not whether this system can be attacked. It clearly can. The tools exist, the doctrines are written, the tests have been conducted. The question is whether we are wise enough to understand what we would lose, because a war in space would not be like other wars. It would not be fought on foreign soil or distant seas. It would be fought everywhere, felt everywhere, and its effects would linger for decades after the last shot was fired. The debris would remain, the orbital shells would be compromised. The trust between nations, the fragile, imperfect trust that allows shared infrastructure to function, would be shattered, and the cost would be borne not only by the combatants but by every nation, every community, every person who depends on a signal from above to navigate, communicate, or understand the world around them. 60 years ago, when the first satellites entered orbit, there was a sense of shared wonder. The sky had become reachable. Signals could be bounced off the heavens and caught again on the other side of the world. It was a triumph of engineering and, in its way, a triumph of hope. The idea that the tools of science could be used to connect rather than divide. That hope is not extinct, but it is under pressure, and the decisions being made now in military laboratories, in orbital testing grounds, in the quiet corridors of intelligence agencies, will determine whether space remains a place of shared benefit or becomes the next battlefield. It is worth remembering that the most transformative thing about space technology has never been its military application. It has been its capacity to make the world smaller, to let a doctor in one country consult with a patient in another, to let a farmer in a drought-stricken region see the rain before it arrives, to let a child in a village without roads connect to the libraries of the world. These are not footnotes to the history of the space age, they are its central achievement, and they are the achievement most at risk. There is a concept in environmental science called the tragedy of the commons, the idea that shared resources, when unregulated, tend to be overexploited and destroyed by the cumulative self-interest of individual actors. Orbit is the ultimate commons. No one owns it, everyone uses it. And the incentives, at present, point toward exploitation rather than stewardship. The nations that invest most heavily in the ability to fight there are, paradoxically, the ones most dependent on its peaceful functioning. The race to dominate space may end not with a winner, but with a shared loss that makes the competition itself seem pointless. The commander of United States Space Command said it plainly in testimony before Congress in March 2025, "Armed conflict in space is not inevitable. The question is whether deterrence holds, whether the incentives align, whether the fragile, unwritten rules that have so far prevented the worst are strong enough to survive the weight of growing arsenals, advancing technologies, and deepening mistrust. There is still time to choose, but the window is not infinite, and the stars, as always, are watching." Thank you for spending this time with me. If this story gave you something to think about, I'd be grateful if you shared it with someone who might feel the same. And if you'd like to hear more, the subscribe button is always there. This has been Streamberg Space Stories. Take care of each other, and good night.